when a one-day-old baby named Paul Joseph Fronzac was stolen from a Chicago hospital in 1964, the heartbreaking story made news across the country. Then, 2 years later, an abandoned toddler was identified as the missing child and returned to his overjoyed parents. But many years later, Paul started digging into the past, and what he found shocked him. But before we start, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell. It only takes a moment, but it helps us share these incredible stories with more people just like you. Paul was 10 when he went searching for Christmas presents in his family's basement. He moved a sofa to squeeze into a crawl space and stumbled on 3 boxes packed with letters, sympathy cards, and old newspaper clippings. One headline read, "200 search for stolen baby." Another said, "Mother asks kidnapper to return baby." In the pictures, he recognized his mom and dad. They looked upset and much younger. Then he read that their baby, Paul Joseph, had been kidnapped. "Wait, that's me," he thought. It was an incredible story. On April 26, 1964, Paul's mom, Dora Fronzac, gave birth to a baby boy at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago. She spent the day nursing him, except when he was resting in the nursery with the other babies. But the next morning, a woman dressed like a nurse walked into Dora's room and said she was taking the baby to see a doctor. She never came back. The staff soon realized something was terribly wrong and began searching, but they didn't call the police or even tell the parents until hours later. At 3 p.m., the hospital phoned the father, Chester Fronzac, at his job in a factory. "My dad had to leave work, go straight to the hospital, and break the news to my mom that the baby was gone," Paul says. "You think a hospital is the safest place, and that's where it happened." It became the biggest manhunt in Chicago's history. Around 175,000 postal workers joined in, along with 200 police officers and the FBI. They searched 600 homes by midnight, but found nothing. Curious and excited by what he'd found, Paul ran upstairs with a handful of the clippings and asked his mom if they were about him. Dora got upset and scolded him for snooping, but then she told him, "Yes, you were kidnapped. We found you. We love you. That's all you need to know." Paul understood not to bring it up again, and didn't, for 40 years. But the question stuck with him, and whenever he was home alone, he'd sneak back into the crawl space to read more. That was how Paul learned the next part of the story, how he ended up living with the Fronzacs. After the kidnapping, Dora and Chester stayed in the hospital for a week, holding on to hope. When they finally returned home, the media wouldn't leave them alone. But even with all the attention, no solid leads came in. Their baby had vanished. Eventually, the case went quiet. Then in March 1966, almost 2 years later, the FBI sent a letter. A toddler had been found in Newark, New Jersey, and he looked a lot like their missing son. The child had been left in a stroller at a crowded shopping center the previous July. He'd since been placed with a foster family, the Eckerts, who had named him Scott McKinley. They'd grown attached to him and were thinking about adopting. But before they could, a New Jersey detective suggested something no one had considered. Maybe this boy was the missing child from Chicago. The FBI decided to follow the lead. But it wasn't easy. There were no records of baby Paul's blood type, and the hospital hadn't taken fingerprints or footprints. All they had was one photo taken on the day he was born. In that picture, the baby's ear looked a lot like the ear of the abandoned toddler. They tested over 10,000 boys who could have been Paul, and I was the only one they couldn't completely rule out, Paul says. Dora and Chester were overjoyed. At the time, the FBI was the top authority, and when they told you something, you trusted them, Paul says. 3 months later, they drove from Chicago to meet the boy in a New Jersey Children's Services office. All of them had gone through psychological evaluations ahead of time. Dora and Chester also had to be officially approved to adopt the boy, now known as Scott. An FBI agent brought me in, and they gave us time to get comfortable. Paul says, My mom had only spent less than a day with her baby before he was taken. And then after all that time, she was face to face with this little kid. Dora later told Paul that in that moment she felt the weight of everything. She could have said, "I don't know," and let the boy go back into the system, or she could say, "Yes, this is my son." And even if she wasn't sure, give that child a chance at a good life. She said it was her son. She did what she believed was right, and I'm thankful she did, Paul says. They brought him home to Chicago and officially adopted him. The Fronzacs were caring parents, though understandably a bit overprotective. That sometimes caused tension. Paul was sent to a Catholic school with a strict dress code, but he was into rock music and liked keeping his hair long. During one argument about his hair, Dora snapped and said, "I wish they'd never found you." Those words stuck. Even now, just thinking about it, I feel it deep down, Paul says. After high school, Paul moved to Arizona to play bass in a rock band. 5 years later, the band split up, so he headed back to Chicago. But he didn't stay long. He was restless and ended up joining the Army for a year. After that, he bounced around, working as a salesman and later as a model and actor. Eventually, he made his home in Las Vegas. "I've probably moved at least 50 times and held over 200 jobs," he says, "but wherever I went, I always kept those newspaper clippings with me." In 2008, Paul got married for the second time. His wife, Michelle, was a teacher, and before long they found out they were expecting a daughter. Paul was thrilled. But when the doctor asked about their family medical history, he realized he didn't really know. Ever since he discovered the kidnapping story, he had quietly wondered if he was really their biological son. "I used to think, what are the odds that I'm the baby who was kidnapped from Chicago?" He'd been found so far away, it just didn't seem likely. Paul had always felt like he didn't quite fit in. His parents seemed closer to his younger brother, Dave. They were all soft-spoken and calm, while Paul was into loud music and fast motorcycles. They looked different, too. Dave was the spitting image of my dad, his voice, his gestures, even his build. I didn't look like either of them. Now that question wouldn't leave him alone. Was he really the missing baby? "I had wanted to do a DNA test with my parents for years," Paul says. "Not because I wasn't happy, I just needed to know. I'd always found reasons to put it off. I didn't want to upset them, but eventually I couldn't ignore it anymore." He'd also worried about the cost. Then one day in 2012, he noticed DNA kits on sale at a store, and he bought a couple. When Paul's parents visited from Chicago, he finally found the courage to bring it up, just about an hour before they were set to leave. "Have you ever wondered if I'm really your son?" he asked. Caught off guard, his parents admitted they had. Then he asked, "Would you want to find out?" Within minutes, all three of them had swabbed their cheeks and sealed the DNA kits. After that, Paul drove them to the airport. But before their plane even landed, Dora and Chester had changed their minds. They called Paul and asked him not to send the kits. To them, he was their son, and that was all that mattered. "I kept those kits in my desk drawer for a couple of weeks," Paul says. "I thought about it every day. I love my parents, and I wanted to respect what they asked. But sometimes you just have to do what feels right. How can it be wrong to want to know the truth?" So he sent them in. Paul was at work when the call came with the results. After confirming his identity with a few questions, he was told there was no remote possibility. He was the biological child of Dora and Chester Fronzac. "It felt like everything in my life just stopped," Paul says. "I could feel the blood drain from my face. I started sweating. I couldn't think straight." Everything he thought he knew, his birthday, his background, being Polish, being Catholic, even his star sign, suddenly didn't mean anything. For a moment, he didn't know who he really was. The results left him with two huge questions. If he wasn't their son, then who were his real parents? And where was the actual Paul Joseph Fronzac? Before he even told his parents, Paul picked up the phone and called a local investigative reporter, George Knapp, to ask for help. Just like that, the story of Paul Joseph Fronzac was back in the national spotlight. His family, who had always avoided the media, were upset. They didn't speak to him for over a year. You have to understand, the main reason I did all this was to help find their real son, Paul says. They were incredible parents. I felt like the best gift I could ever give them was to find their missing child. And I figured the best way to do that was to get the media involved. One big result of going public was that the FBI reopened the Fronzac kidnapping case. They found 10 boxes of original case files stored in Chicago. But since the DNA test proved Paul wasn't the kidnapped baby, he wasn't allowed to access any of it. Still, he managed to speak with Bernie Carey, a retired FBI agent who had worked on the original case. Carey admitted that some investigators had doubts back then about whether they had returned the right child. Paul had better luck digging into his own origins. A group of volunteers called the DNA Detectives offered to help, for free. Led by genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, they used DNA testing along with old-school detective work. Scanning newspaper archives, looking through public records, searching social media, and making countless phone calls. Even though Paul had been found in New Jersey, they eventually traced his biological family to Tennessee. His DNA results also showed Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. We knew one side of his family had to include a Jewish grandparent, Moore explains. But the process was full of setbacks. It took months before they got their first real clue, from a phone call with a possible relative who casually mentioned that there had once been twins in the family who had gone missing. That's when we knew we were finally on the right path, Moore says. On June 3, 2015, 2 years after the search began, Moore called Paul with an update. "What do you think of the name Jack?" she asked. Paul replied, "It's a strong name. I like it." "Well," she said, "that's your name." That's how Paul found out he had been born Jack Rosenthal and that he was actually 6 months older than he'd always believed. His real birthday was October 27, 1963. And there was more. He had a twin sister, Jill. But like him, she had disappeared. Now there was someone else to search for. "I don't think anyone could hear they have a twin and not want to find them," says Moore. Meeting his biological relatives was exciting, especially at first. Paul, who'd always loved music, was thrilled to learn his cousin Lenny Rocco had been a doo-wop singer in the 1950s. To me, it really shows that you don't have to be raised by your biological family to share things like musical talent, Paul says. I wasn't brought up around it, but I was always pulled toward it. I've played in bands all my life, and when I finally met my real family, I got to sit down and play music with Lenny's band. Moore, who's helped reunite thousands of families, says stories like this aren't as rare as people think. People grow up in completely different homes, but when they meet, the similarities are incredible, she says. It's not just looks. It's the choices they've made, who they married, what they named their kids, the jobs they've chosen, even strange little things like their phone passwords. I really believe more is in our DNA than we understand. It's not just coincidence. But not everyone in Paul's birth family welcomed him. It didn't take long for him to uncover a darker side. His birth mother, Marie, had struggled with alcohol, and his father, Gilbert, had come back from the Korean War as an angry man. There are signs that Paul and his twin sister, Jill, who had 2 older sisters and a younger brother, were neglected from early on. Relatives say the twins cried constantly. One cousin even remembered seeing them kept in a cage. No one knows exactly what happened, but whenever family members asked about the twins, they were told someone else in the family was taking care of them. In reality, it seems no one was. Paul believes that something tragic may have happened to Jill, and that afterward the family felt they had to get rid of him too, because they couldn't explain just one twin. In his book, The Foundling, Paul shares the ups and downs of his relentless search for answers. At one point, he even dug up the yard of the old Rosenthal home, hoping, without success, to find any sign of his sister. My real parents weren't good people. Honestly, I'm grateful they abandoned me because that led me to the Fronzacs. They gave me a real life, Paul says. 2 years after the falling out over the DNA results, Paul finally reconnected with Dora and Chester. For the first time, they sat down and talked openly about everything. Dora told him what she'd gone through. I understand now how those events shaped my mom, Paul says. She's carried this guilt her whole life for handing me to that nurse, even though she knows that's what every parent would do in a hospital. The nurse says, "We need to check your baby," and you hand the baby over. But it's haunted her ever since. Dora also gave Paul a photo album and some letters that had been passed down from the Eckerts, the foster family who took care of him for a year and named him Scott McKinley. My mom had this album my whole life and never even mentioned it, Paul says. Looking through it makes me emotional. These are the first photos I've ever seen of myself as a little kid. Even my biological family had none. My grandmother had an album with all the grandkids in order, but the page with the twins was torn out. Paul's dad, Chester, passed away last August, but he still talks with his mom regularly, about every couple of days. Dora will turn 82 on October 27th, which now happens to be Paul's true birthday too. Dora has mixed feelings about Paul's book. She wishes I hadn't shared so much, he says, but I wrote what I felt was an honest story. Paul hasn't stopped trying to find out what happened to Dora's biological son. He's still working with a private investigator, and the next step might be exhuming a body. Actually, 2 bodies. One could be the real Paul, and the other might be my twin sister. It's a complicated and expensive process, but Paul isn't backing down. There are still so many things he doesn't know. This story's far from over, he says. He and his second wife are now divorced, though they've remained friends. Paul admits his deep focus on the search may have played a part in the split. I got to a point where almost every moment of my day was spent on this, he says. Still, he has no regrets. This was something I needed to do. It's brought me a sense of peace I never had before. The journey has also helped Paul understand himself better, especially why he never felt settled. The first couple years of my life really shaped who I am, he says. I can walk away from anyone, any job, any situation, and never look back. I think that comes from having 3 different childhoods, 3 different identities so early on. It's all about adapting, about surviving, about just making it to the next day. C.C. Moore also wonders what young Paul really went through. She's especially curious about the time he spent with the FBI after he was found. What made them so sure he was Paul Fronzac, she asks. Could there have been signs of trauma that they misread, thinking it was from being kidnapped, when it might have been from neglect or abuse before that? Paul's daughter, Emma, is now 9. She likes to joke around and sometimes calls him Jack just to tease him. He doesn't mind, but he hasn't changed his name. I'm staying Paul until they find the real Paul, he says. The day I find him, I'll hand him his birth certificate, and then I'll take mine. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for being here.